Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Westminster College's B.W. Bastian Foundation Diversity Lecture Series for the 2021-2022 academic year. In just a few moments, we will hear from our keynote speaker for tonight's lecture titled Nice White Ladies, the Truth About White Supremacy, Our Role in It, and How We Can Help Dismantle It. I'm Dr. Tamara Stevenson. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I serve as the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer here at Westminster College in Salt Lake City, Utah. So the theme for this year's series is the Counterstory, how policy responds to identity. Counter storytelling is one of the foundational tenets of critical race theory. And this legitimate form of exploration and inquiry magnifies the lived experiences, stories, and truths of structurally marginalized communities. This theme seeks to provoke deep self-reflection of how one considers the lived experiences of others, how these differences impact others' well-being, and how one can contribute to tangible social change. So I'm glad to welcome each and every one of you, including our students, alums, staff, faculty, and campus leadership, along with community partners and friends from near and far to tonight's lecture. I'm sure you had many other options to spend your time, including spring. It's springtime now. However, you chose to be with us tonight, and for that, we thank you for your attendance and your support. At this time, I recognize the tribal communities of the Goshoot, Diné, Navajo, Paiute, Shoshone, and Ute peoples, their elders, both past and present, and their future generations. And we acknowledge their stewardship of Utah's lands. Thank you. I acknowledge our signature sponsor of Westminster's Diversity Lecture Series, the B.W. Bastian Foundation. And the foundation supports local and national institutions that benefit, encourage, and preserve the rights of individuals, promote equality for the LGBTQ community, and support HIV/AIDS programs. On behalf of the college, I thank the B.W. Bastian Foundation for their longtime partnership with Westminster to make this diversity lecture series possible. I also extend gratitude to the following organizations for their partnering sponsorships of our series, along with the Bastian Foundation, including Cigna, Zions Bank, Rocky Mountain Power Foundation, and Mark Miller Subaru. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge our ASL sign language interpreters tonight, and they're sitting in the front, so thank you. We're glad to always make sure that we are creating accessibility to tonight's lecture. Also, you should have received a tear-off survey to share your feedback about tonight's event, so depending on the corner that best describes your experience tonight, you tear that corner that will indicate to us your gauge of tonight's experience. So quickly, let's just talk about tonight's event. Several things motivated the formation of tonight's keynote. It's Women's History Month. Yes. Westminster's 2021-2022 class is 64% female. And yet beyond those narrow parameters, if you will, of the gender binary, we approach an inclusive acknowledgement of womanhood in all its shapes, forms, and expressions. And we wanted to expand the conversation of womanhood through an intersectional lens, which we saw on display this week with the viral job interview, right? In the form of the confirmation hearings of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson for the U.S. Supreme Court. And I have to say on a personal note, when you can look at the screen and see somebody that looks like you, down to the hair, I have been both awestruck and exhausted by the exchange of some of the questions, but we're believing for a righteous end to the hearings in form of her appointments as the first Black woman to the United States Supreme Court in over a 233-year history. So now I'll introduce the speaker. Dr. Jessie Daniels is a faculty associate at the Harvard Beckman Klein Center and a full professor of sociology at Hunter College, an affiliate faculty in Africana Studies, critical social psychology, and sociology at the Graduate Center or the City University of New York. At Hunter, Dr. Daniels directs the master's program in applied social research, which prepares students to work in a data-driven digital society through a mix of courses in statistics, research methods, and critical theory. She is an internationally recognized expert on internet manifestations of racism, and for more than 25 years, she has studied race and racism in various forms of media. Her sixth book, Nice White Ladies, is a project that tries to understand what's behind the Karen phenomenon and so much more about white women's role in the current political landscape. The book was released last fall and is a crossover between self-help, memoir, and a feminist critical race theory book. And Dr. Daniels is set to sign a few books tonight after the lecture, and we may give away a book or two, so don't leave. So Dr. Daniels' visit marks the return of a multi-day in-person campus visit with our Bastian Foundation Diversity Lecture keynote speakers. We aim to create an immersive experience with our diversity keynotes on our campus. So Dr. Daniels has been with us for the past 3 days, meeting with students, staff, and faculty, which included a thankfully short power outage yesterday on our campus and in the neighborhood. And her engaging presence has reminded us of the rewards that come from participating in creating and sharing knowledge. With that said, please help me welcome Dr. Jessie Daniels with a warm round of applause.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for coming out. I really appreciate it. So I appreciate the land acknowledgement that started us off, and I want to just echo that and say that I come to you from Manhattan, which is the unceded land of the Lenape people, and I grew up in Texas, which is the unceded land of the Tejas and Kiwana and Comanche people. So I acknowledge those ancestors and thank them for their stewardship of the land and the living people who continue to guide us in the maintenance of that land. I also want to thank Dr. Tamara Stevenson for reaching out to me originally and for her courage in inviting me here to be with you all tonight. And I want to thank all of you for your courage to hear what I have to say tonight, because it's not always an easy message for people, but I think that together we can get through it. I just want to say a couple of words by way of introduction, and part of that I wanted to say has to do with how grateful I am to be here and recognize that this is the DEI lecture, the Bastian DEI lecture. I want to also thank the sponsor, Mr. Bruce Bastian, for his sponsorship of this and bringing me here. And part of what we usually do when we engage in the practice of DEI, we have a predominantly white institution, which I'll later refer to as PWI, so just jot that down if that's a new term for you. We have these predominantly white institutions in which we invite people of color, often women of color, to come in and do at most a one-day workshop, and then they leave, and then we're still there in this predominantly white institution. And this approach is akin to what James Baldwin was talking about when he asked, why would I want to be integrated into a burning house? We who are raised white are the burning house. The traditional approach to DEI does nothing to change this structure. And for those of you among us who are biblical scholars, and I'm sure there are a few here, it's the Jericho Road story. And for those of you who are not biblical scholars, that story is there's a traveler that gets clobbered on the head and then robbed, and then a good Samaritan comes along to rescue that traveler. The point of the parable, according to liberation theology, is to change the Jericho road, is to transform it, to eliminate the charity of the Good Samaritan. And what I'd like to do tonight in this work is promote that kind of safety through solidarity approach. So my goal tonight here is to invite you to change our approach to DEI and invite my fellow white-raised people to pay attention to how we are creating and contributing to these oppressive systems, the Jericho roads among us, and how we can do a different thing, something in which we see our liberation as connected to the liberation of everyone else. All right, you with me? Great, terrific. Thanks for coming along on this ride, and now I want to tell you a little bit about what I've learned in my immersive few days here in Salt Lake City. And one of the things that I found most intriguing and was most struck by was this, which is an archway that is a monument to the miracle of the seagulls, or the miracle of the gulls, sorry. And I was so struck by that because I actually grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas, and seagulls are sort of a mascot of Corpus Christi. They're everywhere. And last summer I was fortunate enough to be in Iceland, and there were gulls there as well. So I'm sort of following this pattern of gulls around the world. And part of what was interesting to me about this was what the sort of story is about the miracle of the gulls, right? Which is that they saved the early settlers who came, and the story is really rooted in the events of 1848, when the crops were decimated by crickets, and then the gulls came in and ate the crickets and saved the crops. Well, that's the story anyway. But the reality is that the crickets and the gulls were there long before the settlers came, and they were doing that sort of thing all the time. And even at the time, in 1848, the people who experienced that miracle didn't really notice it as a miracle. It was something that was done in retrospect, right? It was labeled retrospectively. So I found that a really interesting sort of local artifact. And part of what it made me question was what's being memorialized, like why that year, why that moment in time to focus on the miracle of the gulls. Because at the same time, right, there were the Ute people, the people of Utah who were indigenous here, and they were already living in this area. And the settlers who came were part of, I'm not sure what that means, but this is from a book called The Whites Wanted Everything, I believe it's called. It's a historical book that just came out in 2019 by a scholar named Will Bagley. And part of what he documents is the way that the early settlers went about hunting Indians, actually pursuing them as if they were wild animals on the frontier. And this is in the period just after 1848. Do you know these names, historical figures in Utah? Who are they? Somebody knows. Okay. Who are they? These are the first three enslaved people that were brought here in the history of Utah, right? These are the names, right? We should all know these names if we're talking about the history of Utah. And I've been driven around by very nice Lyft drivers while I've been here, and they're all very eager to share with me the history of Salt Lake City, and none of them knew these names or knew anything about the indigenous people here, which I thought was really interesting. Slavery is not new, of course, to the United States or unique to the United States, but there was something about the slavery in the United States that was unique, that was peculiar. Some people have called it a peculiar institution. When I was in graduate school, I learned that white women didn't own property, were not allowed to own property. But in fact, the historian Stephanie Jones Rogers, in her recent book from 2019, They Were Her Property, documents through historical records how white women actually were slave owners, often because their father had died and bequeathed enslaved people to them, or they married a man who had enslaved people and they were co-owners with him. And part of what she documents from the narration of formerly enslaved people is that the white women who were slave owners were especially cruel in their treatment of their enslaved property. And part of the reason that she speculates this is that there was a kind of desire to prove their worth, right, as a worthy slave owner. And it was also a way that white women gained a kind of modicum of power in sort of brokering their leverage over enslaved people to pursue a more wealthy husband or to gain more power in the relationship. One reviewer of this work referred to the kind of treatment that white women exerted on their enslaved people as a kind of imaginative sadism. And that's a phrase that really struck with me because it's something that I recognized in my own family. Back to Utah. In 1866, so this is about 20 years or a little more after the Miracle of the Gulls, we have the Circleville Massacre. And so, again, my question about what's being memorialized, why the Miracle of the Gulls and not the Circleville Massacre. I want to also sort of turn our attention to the tiny handful of white women who were pushing against slavery, who wanted to smash slavery, like Angelina Grimke and her younger sister. And she wrote this impassioned plea to the Christian women of the South. Notice that it wasn't to white women, it was to the Christian women of the South. And this is what she said: "I know you do not make the laws, but I also know that you are the wives and mothers, the sisters and daughters of those who do. If you really suppose you can do nothing to overthrow slavery, you are greatly mistaken." So in a lot of ways, I think of what my work is doing is sort of echoing her earlier work, sort of getting us who are raised to believe that we're white to recognize the power that we do in fact have, even if that's provisional power, even if that's power that's because of who we are in relationship to. We do have power in society, and I think it's imperative that we learn how to use it. One more thing just about the context of the settlement of Utah. It happens at this moment where we have the whole rhetoric of the manifest destiny. This is actually a painting called Manifest Destiny. And the feature, I don't know if you can see the details in this painting, but there's a large angelic sort of looking white woman who symbolizes civilization. And if you can see in her hand, she has a book, and it's meant to represent the law. And then the cable, does anybody have an idea about what the cable represents? The telegraph, yeah, so communication, right? It's connected to the poles back there. Behind her is the railroad, right? She symbolizes progress. And below her, I don't know if you can see it in this light, but below her you can see the indigenous people being run off in the foreground there, and then the settlers coming in behind her. And these are very much my people, would have been in the wagons there, settling the territories. So that's the context. We have this historical context in which there are settlers. There's this kind of iconic image of white women as symbolizing civilization, and then there are a handful, just a tiny, tiny minority of white women who are sort of trying to push back against it, right? That's the context in which we find ourselves. Okay, and then what about today? Bringing this forward. So staying in a hotel just around the corner from this, I'm fascinated by this research library, right, of families. And I'm fascinated by what they're beckoning us to discover, right? As I understand it, this is connected to the same Ancestry.com, and we know from the ads from Ancestry.com, they're encouraging us to find the heroes in our family. And these are some of the images that are outside of the library, and you see here it says, "Find your story inside." But it raises the question, right? The scholar Sadia Hartman asks us to question the violence of the archive, right? What's being archived here, and what's being excluded? I wonder if I'm going to go over there tomorrow morning and find out, but I wonder if those first 3 enslaved people are in this library as well, if they're archived as well. And it's an open empirical question, as we say in sociology. I don't know the answer to it, but it would be interesting to find out. So we have to ask what's being archived, what's being memorialized when we're thinking about our role in these oppressive systems. So this was another interesting discovery here in Utah. I didn't know this organization existed until I got here, but the Daughters of Utah Pioneers. And this is just a photo from 2021. These are the young women who've been elected as royalty of the Daughters of the Pioneers. And I looked on their website about what it is their organization does, and I'll just read read from that. The Society is a women's organization based upon identifying and honoring the pioneers who came to Utah. The aim is solely for historical, educational, and public purposes and is completely non-political and non-sectarian. And that's a great motto, but I want to, with humility, suggest that there is a politics behind celebrating these lovely young women and hearkening back to the daughters of the pioneers, right? It does carry with it a particular political agenda, and that's part of what I'm interested in exploring with you all tonight. So what's the harm of settler colonialism? I think there's a lot of harm that we could identify, but here locally, I mean, there were what got called boarding schools, sometimes called reservation schools, and we know now the historical record is being revealed and that many of these children actually died in custody. But there was another harm to settler colonialism in these schools, which were very often and most typically run by white women. And part of what the harm of settler colonialism does is it annihilates culture, right? Part of the purpose of these reservation schools was to wipe out Indian culture. I mean, that was really explicitly stated in them. And there's documentation that this is not a peculiar event to Utah. It happened all across North America and in the United States and Canada. And it also happened in Australia, these reservation schools that were really meant to indoctrinate indigenous people into whiteness. That's really the purpose of it. Okay. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Maybe I'm not. There we go. So how does that fuel the extremism of today? As Dr. Tam mentioned in the introduction, part of my work is on far-right extremism, and I noticed that you've had some experience with that here locally. Just last year, there were 21 individuals who were arrested for this kind of extremism. And part of what I'm working on in a new project is looking at the way the sort of taken for granted assumptions about whiteness and white citizenship fuel this kind of extremism. My thinking about it right now is that the connection between them is that once people feel that they have a right to land, this is my land, I am going to take ownership of it, then it fuels this kind of extremism when they feel that that land is being taken away from them. So I think that these are quite closely connected. Okay, so to the book. So who is a nice white lady? I get this question a lot, and deservedly so with a book of this kind of title. And the short answer is we all are. All of us who are raised to believe that we're white and raised to be femme-identified. I didn't mention, but I use she, her pronouns, and I don't take a gender binary view at all, but there is something in the baggage that we get, those of us who are raised to be femme-identified. The title of the book is meant to be a play on words and to suggest a questioning of what it means to be raised white and what it means to be a lady. My work and the project of the book and my talk tonight, really my life's work, is to trouble these constructed ideas of whiteness and ladyhood because they do a lot of damage. I believe that any human-made thing can be undone, sometimes very, very quickly, if we have the will to do it. So that's part of what I'm doing tonight, is hoping to elevate that will in all of us to undo these damaging constructs. Okay, so let's talk about what it means to be a nice white lady these days. It's actually getting to be a kind of uncomfortable subject position. Now, subject position is one of those academic terms. It just means who you are in the world, how other people look at you. And the the subject position of being a white woman is a little uncomfortable these days. I don't know how many of you saw this Saturday Night Live monologue by a comedian by the name of Bill Burr. It was in October of 2020. There was a lot of other stuff going on that year that you might not have noticed. Saturday Night Live had him on. But he does this riff on white women, and I was laughing along with the riff as he started, and then he got to the point where he turned to white women and he said, well, you've got to sit down and shut up, sit next to me, in other words, and take your talking to, he says. And it was at that point where I thought, oh, well, this gets a big middle finger salute from me. I don't want any white man telling me to sit down and shut up. Thank you very much. And then this same monologue got resurfaced, as they say, just in the last couple of weeks, when I'm sure you all heard the remarks from Jane Campion at the Critics' Choice Award, when she, instead of just saying thank you very much for the award and sitting down, she decided to riff on how she had it much worse than Serena and Venus Williams. Right, thank you for that collective groan. That is the appropriate response to those remarks. Okay, so, and this was a Halloween mask also from the fall of 2020, and this was created by an artist in Los Angeles, and he put these for sale on Etsy, the craft site that is very popular among white women, including me. This is meant to be a Karen mask, and in an interview, the artist said that he was sort of looking, he does masks every Halloween, and he was looking around for ideas, and he said that in 2020, the Karen was the scariest thing happening. And so he created that mask. And again, this is a white man, a white cisgender man who's creating this mask, and it always gives me a little hesitance when I see the sort of riff on Karens coming from a straight cisgender man. I'm like, is this really misogyny, or is this a pointed critique? So the white women, pushback against white women also resulted in this New York Post article, and I generally wouldn't share with you a New York Post headline just because it's sort of a notorious rag in New York City and not worth mentioning, but part of what happened here is that this story got picked up by David Brooks in the New York Times. Now, this is about independent booksellers, and they, doing the work, invited some women in to talk about the what's up with white women, and then David Brooks featured it not a week later in the esteemed New York Times, paper of record for the United States, and he said, you run across workshops, linked to the New York Post, on topics like what's up with white women, as if all the white women in the world were somehow one category. Well, all due respect to Mr. Brooks at the New York Times, but that is not, I promise you, what the women who are running that workshop were saying, and it's certainly not what I'm arguing. There is a way, though, that white women take up a lot of space in the culture, especially Western culture, particularly American culture. And one of the exercises I sometimes have my students do in class is go back through and do a content analysis of all the Hollywood issues of Vanity Fair. They love this exercise. And just do a simple count of the race of the women featured on the cover. Now, you know this issue, right? It's every year about this time of year before the Oscars, they feature the actresses who are, I think, nominated or likely to be nominated. And it's really a sea of whiteness. There's occasionally a Lupita Nyong'o or a Kerry Washington or an Angela Bassett or a Halle Berry, but I can name all of them, and it's not even a handful, right? And the rest are white women. So part of my argument in this work is really that there's a way in which we as white women are kind of everywhere in the culture, and yet we're nowhere. And that makes it really hard to analyze as a category, as a subject position. And we have to be able to talk about what it means to be a white woman in this culture. And of course, I don't mean that all white women are the same, and no one who's doing this kind of work does, but as a response to Mr. Brooks, I'll just spend a little time with a wonderful quote from Natasha Stovall, who is both a wonderful writer and also a trained psychotherapist. And she writes, "What is whiteness? And which one? Farm-to-table white or Cracker Barrel white? Rust Belt white or Sun Belt white? Electric car white or pickup truck white? Digital white or analog white? 1% honky or precariat au fait, Italian, Irish, English, Ukrainian, Polish. And my own little riff on Dr. Stovall's take on that was one that adds gender. So for white women specifically, we can ask Martha Stewart White or Paula Deen White, Real Housewives of Salt Lake City White, or or Honey Boo, I had to get it in, or Honey Boo Boo of McIntyre, Georgia White, Catholic working class Boston White, or Jewish wealthy apartment on the Upper East Side and house in the Hamptons White, Ivanka Trump American businesswoman White, or Sheryl Sandberg, chief operating officer of Facebook White. These distinctions of taste, culture, religion, and wealth divide white women in significant ways, yet these different shades of whiteness don't diminish the power of whiteness, but rather strengthen it because people use these variations to reassert their unique individualism. Okay. So I just want to now do this thing that's called Situating Myself, where I'm going to introduce you to my family a little bit. This comes from a tradition in Black feminist thought known as positionality, which again is one of those clunky academic terms. But basically it just means you as the researcher or the writer should tell the audience your relationship to the material that you're discussing. The assumption really is that there is no objective truth, that we're always in relationship to truth, and that to acknowledge that is to acknowledge our own power in the situation, right? So acknowledgement to Black feminist thought for this next section. So this is a photograph that I talk about in the book. And this is 4 generations of white women in my family. This is the photograph, as far as I know, is taken in 1962. I am the babe in arms there. And I'm being held by my great-grandmother, who we called Little Granny because she was shorter than her daughter, who's next to her, who we called Big Granny. We were very sophisticated. And as the 10 of us who were grandchildren, as we grew taller than Little Granny, it was always kind of a rite of passage. And then on the end there, in the fashionable polka dots and sunglasses, is my mother, Shirley. I use this photograph a lot, and I love it really because it so clearly locates me at the end of this line of white women who raised me, and it makes me think about how different my life is from theirs. So none of the women in that photograph, certainly my Little Granny and Big Granny, never finished elementary school. I'm not sure that Little Granny ever went to school. My mother, I know for sure, did go to school, but she never got past 10th grade. And there were other things about them besides not getting an education. They were both really, my Little Granny and and Big Granny were both really good seamstresses. Those dresses that they're wearing, they made them. My mother was really funny and had a super sharp wit and was really smart. She was a straight A student before she dropped out. And the reason that she dropped out of the 10th grade is because she got married when she was 15, as did those other 2 women. And they were all pregnant by the time they were 16. They would want me to tell you that they were not pregnant when they got married. That would have been very important for you to know. And Big Granny, in the middle there, she was funny too, made great white bread and butter and sugar sandwiches, and she was really, really mean. She is the person in my family that I identify with that imaginative sadism, because she was a cruel, cruel woman. But they had other values, and those other values are some of the ones that I have taken on. And one of the values is that these women all were good house cleaners, as am I. I do not wash the sheets every day, nor do I iron them, as my Big Granny did. But they all had a sort of value about cleaning, was that if you made a mess, you should clean it up. And I kind of think about that in relationship to white supremacy. I think about white supremacy as the mess that we've created and that we need to clean it up, we who are raised to be white and femme-identified. So I don't know what term you think of when you hear white supremacy. It may be that you think about the people in the funny outfits, with the flags, with the tattoos. But what I want you to think is settler colonialism, the people who settled land and took it from indigenous people. And I want you to learn to see whiteness. Those of us who are raised to be white have a real problem learning to see whiteness because we're not used to it, because we've not had to, right? But those people who are raised outside that category are very practiced at it. And you can read about it going back as early as, W.E.B. Du Bois, great sociologist, who first black PhD from Harvard, shout out to Judge Jackson. And he wasn't able to get an academic job after that, but he wrote some of the most profound work that we have observing whiteness. There's a great book called The Souls of White Folk that is still relevant today, written in about 1920, I believe. So take a look at that. If you're not used to seeing whiteness and want to start figuring it out, learn to see whiteness. So if the phrase white supremacy throws you off, think settler colonialism, think, how do I learn to see whiteness? Okay, and here's the rest of my family. This is my father's side. So this is my paternal grandfather on the very end. That's my father, JT, in the middle, and then me. I'm about 11, I think, in Corpus Christi, and this is where I grew up mostly. My father was a great dad growing up, and his father, not so great. He was also the person that molested me when I was a child. And I knew that my whole life. It wasn't like a recovered memory or something, but I always knew that. And so you can see I'm like standing on the other side of my father just to sort of put some distance between me and him. He died when I was about 14 or so, and I didn't think about him much after that. He wasn't a presence in my life, and I actually don't know that much about him. So tomorrow morning when I go over to the library, I might look him up. One thing that I did find out about him, though, when I was at my great aunt's house, when I pulled this book off the shelf. This is Thomas Dixon's The Klansman, spelled with a C for reasons I don't really understand. But I pulled it off the shelf in my great aunt's house. We were in Missouri, and said, Aunt Marie, why do you have this book on your shelf? And she said, I don't know. I think it was your granddad's. I was like, why did he have it? He's long since dead at this point. And I open it up, and I see his name written in the flyleaf, and I said, well, why did he have it? And she's like, oh, I think he was in that group. And she went back into the kitchen, and my father, who was sitting there reading the paper, I was like, excuse me, did you know this? And he's like, yeah, it was no big deal. And he sort of pops the paper, It was no big deal, excuse me? And that moment really changed things for me, because I was in the middle of doing a PhD dissertation on the Klan, and my father knew that, and yet he had never told me this. And I was like, interesting thing to leave out. And he said, well, no, they were just trying to help people. And I knew from the historical record that they were not, in fact, trying to help people. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, if a guy was beating his wife, then they would go over and convince him not to do that anymore. And that was the end of the discussion. He did not want to talk about it anymore. What's interesting about this to me is that after I've revealed this fact, I have so many people, often white race people, who will come up to me sort of sotto voce after a talk and say, so was my grandfather. This should not be a surprise to us. There were the estimates are from 2 to 4 million people in the Klan in the 1920s, when my grandfather would have been in the Klan. And part of that was because of this film, which ended up being a really effective recruiting tool for the Klan. It was based on the book, and it propagates that lie of black male rapists and white women as vulnerable to attack. But I didn't know any of that until I got to graduate school. I went to Texas public schools my whole life. Never once did someone mention lynching in K through 12. Just didn't know it existed, didn't know what it was. And then I had a job as a research assistant working for Joe Fagan and his research partner, Mel Sykes. And this was really a profound, transformative experience for me when I was at UT Austin, because it forced me, my job was transcribing these interviews of middle-class black Americans and their experiences with racism. And I think probably when I sat down to that project, I was a fairly standard issue white liberal, in that I thought if people are talking about discrimination in this day and age, the late 1980s, that they must be exaggerating or seeing things that aren't there. But it only took me 2 or 3 interviews in to see that there was a real pattern, and that instead of exaggerating things, what the people in these interviews were doing was they were trying to not make it be about racism. They were trying to think of every explanation possible to say, I don't think it was racism. I think I just got seated in the back of that restaurant by the kitchen because the other tables, they were empty, but I'm sure there was a reason that I got seated back there. So that was really transformative for me. It also changed me because it introduced me, I didn't have the language for it at the time, but it introduced me to this idea of white mediocrity and the white mediocrity of my own family. I had grown up with the racist idea that black people didn't value education, which is a lie from the devil. But in this project, what I heard and witnessed were people who had advanced degree after advanced degree after advanced degree. So one of the things that they did as a coping mechanism for the racial discrimination that they saw every day was to get additional degrees, do everything perfectly. And we saw that again with Judge Jackson, right, who has done the same sort of being twice as good as. And what it did to me was it shined the light on my own family. It's like, no, we're the ones who don't value education, right? My father went to the University of Houston, but he didn't finish because he got pissed off at a professor and said, screw her, I don't need this degree, and walked out. So it was really my family that didn't value education. So let's get back to white women and the harm that we do. There is real harm that we do about in terms of sort of enacting white supremacy in different ways. And I'm going to give you just a few examples and then talk about some of the ways that we can do better, that we can change. So this is one of the, this is a really painful image. This is Mamie Till Mobley, who is standing over the coffin, the open casket of her son, Emmett Till. And Emmett Till, as you probably remember, was killed in 1955. He was a 14-year-old child, and he was killed because Carolyn Bryant pointed her finger at him and said that he had, in different versions, whistled at her, looked at her, touched her, made an advance at her. Some 50 years later, as an 80-year-old woman, Carolyn Bryant recanted that story, and yet Emmett Till is still dead because she pointed her finger at him. And it's that harm that I'm trying to get to. And this horrible, painful example is not isolated in American culture. Not even close. It's a pattern. And there's some more harm that we do. There's Marsha Blackburn talking to Judge Jackson. This is not a lynching, but it was a disrespectful and painful sort of questioning that was beneath the dignity of Judge Jackson, right? And this is Amy Cooper. I don't know if you remember this. This happened not too far from where I live in New York City. This woman, her name's Amy Cooper. She's in a section of Central Park where you're not allowed to have your dog off leash. There are other areas really close to this spot where you can have your dog off leash. And Christian Cooper, who likes to bird watch, was there early in the morning. He's African American, no relation. And he just asked her to leash her dog. Ma'am, would you leash your dog? And she starts freaking out, saying, what are you doing? What are you doing, right? And in one of the most chilling displays, the power of white women, she gets on the phone to 911 and she throws her voice about half an octave and says, I'm in danger. There's an African American man who's videotaping me and threatening me. Come quick, right? This is the same day in May of 2020 when 12 hours later, George Floyd is on the sidewalk on the street in Minneapolis, and a cop has his knee on his throat. And a young 17-year-old African-American girl is filming the life go out of his body. These happened on the same day, and for me, they are forever twinned, because the thing that she's trying to do is to bring down on Christian Cooper, this lovely African-American gay man who likes to watch birds. She's trying to make happen to him what happened to George Floyd that day. That's the harm that we do. And before there were Karens, there were Beckys, right? This is Barbecue Becky. She called 911 on a black family who was setting up a barbecue pit, which is both legal and quite ordinary and not at all scary. But she called 911 and the police came, and then that family turned their cameras on her, and when she started being videoed, she ran away and cried. And this is another woman who got called Permit Patty, who was upset that there was a young black girl, I believe she was 8 years old, selling water on the sidewalk near her home without a permit, and called the police. The other way that we create harm as white women is that we engage in what some people call performative activism. Now, what do I mean by performative activism? Performative activism is when you're more concerned with the selfie that you're going to take than with staying in the movement, than staying connected to people and watching change happen. At this same march, this is the Women's March of 2017, right after a certain GOP candidate got elected, which, by the way, a majority of white women voted for, which is the point of the sign in the foreground. But there were white women at this march who were carrying signs that said, if Hillary had been elected, I would be at brunch now. And that is what I mean by performative activism. These women have shown up because they have been personally affected by this political decision, but they were not there in the recent, prior to that, Black Lives Matter protests. That's performative activism. So what's going on? Why this harm that we create? Well, part of it, I say, and this is the opening line in the book, that it's our comfort, nice white ladies, and our protection are fundamental to American culture, and it's killing all of us. It's destroying all of us. It's not new, but we pretend that it's new. This is a book that I mentioned when I was in class with Dr. Tam the other day by Veron Ware. This is really rooted in colonialism and the way that white women were really the symbol of the colonial and the British Empire. Joe Fagan, my advisor, calls the British the original colonizers, which if anybody has any Irish ancestry here, we'll be delighted to hear that, but no offense to the Dutch in case they wanted that title. And in the civil rights movement, we like to say that we would have been, on the front lines with Dr. King fighting for civil rights. But in fact, what white women were doing were, as historian Elizabeth McGray points out, were being the constant gardeners of segregation. It was white women who were on the front lines supporting segregation, fighting against the civil rights movement. And in my 2009 book, I looked at a place called Stormfront. Don't go there. It's a portal for white supremacists. And I was looking at the way it had changed from the printed documents to the online era. And basically what I learned is that there was an area there for ladies only. The forum was actually called Ladies Only. And, they sounded like liberal feminists. They thought men were silly. They thought women should have equal pay for equal work. They were okay with LGBTQ rights. And they were for a woman's right to have an abortion as long as, they just thought the wrong people were having abortions. And part of the argument I made in that book is that there is a way in which if our feminism isn't grounded in a critical perspective on race, then it inevitably is seamless with white supremacy. It just happens automatically. But we kind of pretend it's new. There were a lot of articles that were in the popular press in 2016 that kept asking this question over and over and over again in different ways. Why do white women vote against their own interests when they vote for the GOP? It's a dumb question, and I'm really, really tired of it because it misses a key fact, which is that whiteness is their interest. That's what they're voting for. And we have to learn to see that, right? We have to learn to see where whiteness is someone's interest, where people are invested in whiteness. It's not a left-right issue. I don't want you to think that I'm here just to harsh on the women that voted for Trump, although let's have a talk about what you're doing there. But it's on the left as well. Whiteness shapes all of our lives, left and right alike. And I want to spend a second talking about one of my favorite white women. Really, she is the gift that keeps on giving. She really, really is. In the last decade, in case you have missed this Oscar-winning actor, Gwyneth Paltrow, who sort of comes from Hollywood royalty, I don't know if you know about her parents, her father's a famous director, her mother's Blythe Danner, She has left Hollywood. She doesn't act anymore. She's not in filmmaking, but she does Goop full time. And Goop is this lifestyle company that she's created, and she's made a $250 million fortune through the company Goop. And the wellness section at Goop offers a variety of seemingly dubious products and treatments, from an emotional detox bath soak to supplements and clean food. We'll talk more about that in a second. To, hold on to your seats, it's Women's History Month, so I can say this, to vaginal eggs and vaginal steams, which no one needs. The other thing that she talks about is something called earthing. Have you heard about earthing? Has this made it to Utah? Well, right, this is really, to put it very in plain terms, the art of walking barefoot outside, which as a child growing up in Texas, I did all the time. But apparently this has some special meaning, which Gwyneth is not too clear about. So, okay, next up I have a tiny video clip, and this is the high wire act of doing your presentation. So let's see if this works.
What is earthing?
Oh, okay. So one of the things we like to do on Goop is find kind of what the alternative world says about, like, you know, feeling good in the modern day world. So earthing, I don't actually know that much about earthing, and it came out of me not knowing anything about earthing, but hearing about it. It's kind of, they say that we've lost touch with sort of being barefoot in the earth, and that there's some type of electromagnetic thing that we're missing. And
that is
so
true.
It's good to take your shoes off and walk in the grass. Okay. I don't know what the we talk about.
Well, I don't want to harsh on Gwyneth. Who cares if you walk outside barefoot? Do it if it makes you feel good. But what's interesting about this clip, and part of why I bring it up and went to all the trouble to make that work, that was amazing that worked, is that what she's doing there is really a great contemporary example of settler colonialism, right? She's saying there's this alternative world, by which she means indigenous people, and they have these practices that I don't really know much about, but I'm just gonna lift them and put them for sale on Goop, and I'll pocket my money. And I'm not sure if any indigenous people are getting money from Gwyneth, but I think not, right? So when I was saying that stuff at the beginning about settler colonialism, it's not because I wanna just harsh on people in Salt Lake City. It's because it's all around us. We're still doing this. The extraction economy of settler colonialism still exists, right? And it's an everyday practice. And one of the other places we see this is in this very successful franchise with white women called Eat, Pray, Love. It was a popular memoir, and then a popular movie, which is doing a similar kind of thing, except she's moving to different countries and extracting just the things that she wants from each culture. It's a very American approach to other cultures, right? And then there's the whole yoga thing. There's a wonderful scholar by the name of Ruma Pucha, who has done decades of work on yoga and the way it's practiced in the United States. And she's actually from India, from South Asia, and so I want to acknowledge her work. She writes that yoga has become the sine qua non of wellness for white women. It holds the promise, in a way, of both thinness and enlightenment. And so it is very appealing, and it's very lucrative. The figures are about $16 billion are spent every year on classes, clothing, equipment, and accessories in yoga in the United States, and 72% of those are women. They don't break down those statistics by race, but I have a guess that they're mostly white women. And part of what this scholar writes about with the way that we practice yoga in the United States is that it's denuded, it's stripped of all its cultural heritage, right? This is really from a Hindu cultural practice, and there's a way that it gets interpreted through a sort of nonviolent Gandhian lens that sort of eliminates the way that Hindus have persecuted Muslims within India, and it also doesn't reckon with the kind of racism that Gandhi himself practiced. So there are lots of things that are problematic about this, but part of what I argue in the book is that what it does for white women is that it allows us to go into a space that we imagine is filled with light and love, but it is really often a white-dominated space, and that's part of what the comfort is that we extract from yoga, because it's a place of sameness, and we equate sameness with safety, which is the opposite of what safety should be. So you may have run across this. If you read the book, I talk about this example at some length. This is a woman who goes by the name, I think her actual name is Polachek, but she wrote a piece about encountering a full body size black woman in her yoga class, and she kind of freaks out about it. And then, for reasons that are still unknown to all of us, she wrote about it, and the internet sort of went crazy about it. So it's a really interesting story, but I think it's interesting because it illustrates that her comfort in the space of a yoga studio was really based upon it being filled with only other white women. And so when a black woman entered the space, she had all these questions and concerns about what she should do to help this woman with her practice of yoga. And part of what's going on with the Eat, Pray, Love franchise, and that spawned a whole other cottage industry of books like that, is that it is a kind of extension of American empire. And what doesn't get said in the Eat, Pray, Love book and others like that is that this emerged after 9/11. And so there's a way in which American empire is implicated. At the time, the American nation is waging war against lots of different countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, and at this time, at that particular moment, this white woman is sort of traveling around unencumbered by that context, but also enjoying the benefits of it in a particular way. Okay, whiteness also shapes how we think about leadership. I know that you all are starting a new leadership institute here, and I think that's fabulous, but I think we have to reconsider what we mean by leadership. And this really is rooted in sort of some of our ideas about feminist empowerment. Who are we empowering ourselves for? Is this an individual sort of empowerment, or is this a collective empowerment for the liberation of all of us? One of the things I discovered here in Salt Lake and maybe in broader Utah is that there's been a real uptick in eating disorders since the pandemic. And some of those eating disorders, we tend to think of anorexia or bulimia as eating disorders, but part of what this article was talking about was a particular kind of exercise bulimia, where people say, oh, I ate those fries, so I'm gonna go run it off, or I'm gonna go bike it off, or I'm gonna go do something like that. And that is a really destructive sort of extension in some ways of white supremacist culture that takes a real toll on women across all racial and ethnic backgrounds, but including women who are raised to be white. And this was an interesting thing I learned about Utah, and specifically about Salt Lake City. There's apparently a big rise in cosmetic surgery here. I don't know if that's related to the Real Housewives franchise at all, but to me it suggests a kind of body dysmorphia, right? A kind of, I don't like the way my body looks, and so I'm gonna find ways to surgically alter it. And then the other eating disorder that I talk about in the book is this orthorexia, obsessed with healthy eating. And in some ways, what this has to do with is a kind of purity notion, right? Which we know is also part of the idea of whiteness, that somehow we want things that are pure and those appeal to us. And orthorexia is this notion of being really obsessed with clean eating, of a kind of purity in eating. And it again, is very destructive. So the banner that gets held aloft over self-care is this Audre Lorde quote, which I love, actually, that caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And Audre Lorde, also an alum of Hunter College, I'm proud to say, and lesbian warrior, mother, poet, was talking about a particular kind of practice as a black woman who was under siege in a society that did not want her to be alive. And the way that self-care gets practiced today in the United States is not really part of political resistance. I mean, if we're honest about what we're doing. The kind of self-care on offer from the wellness industry is not engaged in sustaining people as they fight for liberation, as Audre Lorde was doing. Self-care is a billion-dollar business, billion with a B, and that industry, although it deploys this quote from Audre Lorde at every turn, it also feeds a particular kind of gendered white narcissism, which is at the heart of the very culture that's destroying all of us. White women's narcissism, our white narcissism, causes us to use our privilege and resources to turn inward and focus only on our own bodies and delude ourselves into thinking that that is political warfare. That turn inward also reinforces a kind of smug self-satisfaction and barricades off any connection with or responsibility to a wider community or the environment. As white women obsess about clean eating, the people of Flint, Michigan haven't had clean drinking water since 2014. So I think we have to do better than that. And part of what I argue in the book is that without care and connection, without community, self-care is just helping us feel better about living under capitalism. Part of the reason that what we get sold as self-care feels good is because it's retail therapy. If you live in capitalism, it feels good to buy stuff, right? Because there are all sorts of ways that capitalism doesn't take care of us as full human beings. And when we buy stuff, we get a little hit of dopamine, right? That's where retail therapy comes from. It's fun, right? So the question that I want to turn to now is where we are, who we are in relation to. And I'm going to move quickly to the end from here. So one of the things I learned is that Utah ranks high in using the apps for dating, and it was popular in COVID as well. Popular everywhere, but apparently you folks are really good at it. One of the things we know about the dating apps, because you know they collect your data when you're on them, right? And one of the things we know is that OkCupid reveals that white women have a really strong preference for dating white men. And that has been replicated again and again and again. I'll just stop there. And part of that is about forming families, right? White women want to form white families. But part of my argument is that the families that we form are often seen as fortresses. This is the McCloskey pair who were out in front of their, it's called a St. Louis Palazzo in the Midwest, as peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters walked by. And it's easy to laugh at them. I laugh at them every time I see this picture. But there's something in this that really is telling on us as white people in the way that we see our homes. This is another white woman who helped her husband start a far-right militia, and now she has regrets. And I'm from Texas, and don't marry him, you won't regret it later. But the families that we create and the wealth that we pass on from those families is part of what is the engine of white supremacy. And it's not just this family, it's all the white families who are passing on their wealth to the children. If you haven't listened to this podcast, the title of my book is a little riff on that. And we can talk in the Q&A about how 911 contributes to this. It's not just the Karens who are calling 911, it's all of us who are using 911, who are using a system that's created for our comfort. And this is killing all of us. This is a wonderful book. If you haven't read Jonathan Metzl, do. He has extensive research on this, and basically what he argues is that when we are attached to whiteness, when we're invested in whiteness, then it starts to have this kind of blowback effect on us where it shortens our life. And he talked to people in Missouri and Kansas and in one other state that I'm forgetting, and he asked them about their attachment to these policies that pass for whiteness. And what he argues is that we're dying of whiteness. And there's good epidemiologists on this that we actually don't quite understand. Epidemiologists are puzzled by this fact Suicide rates have soared among middle-aged white women in the United States. Once white women reach the age of 45, the suicide rates start to go up. My theory, the epidemiologist didn't ask me, but my theory is that there's a way in which when we age as white women, our value in the marketplace of society goes down, and that's part of what's driving this. They talk about the deaths of despair that end the life of particularly middle-aged white women. And I'll just end by saying this is what I think in part happened to my mother. There was certainly the imaginative sadism of her mother, of Big Granny, but my mother was also a white woman who was in middle age. She died at 48. I was 21. And part of that was about a despair at the dream that she had of being a middle-class housewife and how rotten that dream was really at its core. And you know, there's a lot that's been written about sort of the despair of housewives, but I don't think there's enough yet on sort of how white women are at the core of that. I know I'm short on time, but I just want to quickly say that we have to divest from whiteness, and I can say more in the Q&A about that, but I'll just end by saying this. Last November, I turned 60 years old, and somebody, very much, and honestly, when my mother died when she was 48, it's all made up from here for me. I'm just like, what does this look like? I don't have anyone in my family that lived very long. And the reason I say that is not for you to tell me that I don't look 60, which you're welcome to do, but to say that what we have to do to divest from whiteness is we have to invest in intergenerational work. And so it took me till I was 60 to be able to tell you this story. And for those of you who are younger, if you're 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, learn from me, speed up. We're running out of time. I want you to get these lessons and then create your own change from here. So thank you very much. I'll just end there and take your questions. Yeah, so I think somebody has a mic and they're gonna, if people have questions. There's a nice person with a mic. Thank you very much. I know I threw a lot at y'all. Yeah, there's a question right there.
Hi. Can you comment a little bit deeper on, you were talking about the desire to feel pure with like the orthorexia and also the like exercising it off. Just a little bit more about what that means.
Yeah, there's a kind of famous anthropologist by the name of Mary Douglas who wrote a quite famous book. I'm going to forget the date, but it's called Purity and Danger. And she says that in every culture, people have sort of lines about what's pure and what's impure. And so if you think about the Jewish tradition and treif, and kosher, like what's allowed to eat and what you're not allowed to eat. And she says that is a powerful cultural thing that we do as human beings, is to sort of say this is okay and that's not okay. And I think in the context of talking about whiteness, there's a way in which purity is one of those core, when we're trying to define what is whiteness, one of the core ideas of it is purity. And that goes back to this idea of the pure white blood, which we know that there's not. Blood is typed by A, B negative, O positive, blah, blah, blah. There's not black blood and white blood. We all have the same blood. But in the white supremacist imagination of a century ago and today, people think that interracial marriage is impure because it's mixing blood, right? So that idea of purity is really deep in the culture, if we wanted to call it white supremacist culture, but it's a really deep idea. And then when you start putting gender into it, right, the idea of being pure and virginal is really central to the idea of of what we were raised to be and do as white women. I mean, I grew up with a terror of you better not turn up pregnant. That was how I thought it happened. You turned up pregnant. And the other idea was that, women wore white to get married in because it signified that they were virgins, like had never had sex before, which is a really bad idea if you're getting married. But anyway, but But, you know, and I remember my mother sort of saying, well, she doesn't deserve to wear white. Can you believe she wore white to that? Well, she didn't. Right? So this idea of purity is like really deep. And now what we've done in the 21st century is we've put all that onto kind of our bodies in a new way in terms of exercise, like being pure is like 0% fat. There's this whole fascination with having 0% body fat, which is super unhealthy. And I mean, unless you're an ultra athlete or something. And then food gets that same way, you know, gets that same treatment of is it pure? And people talk about clean eating as if it's as if that's a real thing. And if you talk to nutritionists, they're like, what does that mean, clean? You mean the lettuce was washed before you ate it? No, it's clean. And people mean different things. They mean it doesn't have sugar, it doesn't have gluten, it doesn't have, you know, unprocessed flour, but it's a concept, it's not a nutrition fact. So, there's another question here.
So I had some friends decline my invitation to join me tonight because they said that your message vilifies white women. So what would you say in response to that?
Thanks for raising that question. Yeah, I 100% don't mean to vilify white women. And it's part of why I put myself and my own story in the text so much. You know, again, and not to center myself, but to say I've experienced this too, and this is what I've been through. And I really, you know, the thing I was saying at the end about I really want to speed this up and get us all to a place where we can talk about these ideas without the sort of defensiveness of saying this is vilifying white women. I think that part of what we have to do is learn to see whiteness and see it as understanding our own whiteness and how it shapes our experience is tied up in this whole project of liberation. So, I mean, part of what I would say to your friends that declined to come is I hope they'll give this book a chance and see that I'm really not vilifying white women, that I'm really trying to, what I say is call in white women. I'm really inviting them to come with me on this journey and see how whiteness has shaped their lives and how they might transform their lives in ways that don't shore up white supremacy. Because if we don't acknowledge it, we're just contributing to these oppressive systems over and over again. Thanks so much for the question. Somebody else.
So for starters, I have really enjoyed this talk, and I'm happy to have been here. So I did a lot of diversity work at Duke University before I moved to Utah, and it was challenging because I'm a Black woman and having to, hopefully to not offend anyone, but there were a lot of white tears, and I didn't know how to. It has been challenging. And I like how you said at the beginning how a lot of times we bring in like these Black women or Black people of color to speak to spaces that don't identify. And so we're trying to teach something that just doesn't connect. And so I know you kind of hinted at this, but you weren't able to get to the end, but is there anything that you could say? Because I know I had no words. I was like, it was more of, I could comfort you and I can try to set up programs, I could try to bring in people, but it left me and a lot of the staff who were doing that work kind of like hopeless and burnt out because, again, we experienced the racism and everyone experienced different forms of racism, but then to try to teach someone from a perspective that's not connected.
I think part of what we have to do is one of the first things I suggest in the conclusion is that people start to take an inventory. So, I mean, I think for me, what that inventory means is looking at our family history, but maybe some of the stuff that isn't in the archive, right? What are the ways which, you know, like my grandfather being in the Klan is not in a searchable database anywhere that I can find online, right? I found that out by pulling a book off the shelf at my aunt's house, right? So, I mean, I think finding the family archive and finding out things like, did I grow up in a house that had a deed restriction, right? Deed restrictions are this house cannot be sold to someone who is Jewish or someone who is Black, right? If that was the house, the deed that you grew up with, that may have shaped your experience, right? And I really think that the message is, if you retrospectively look back and think, oh, during slavery, I would have 100% been Angelina Grimke, and being, an abolitionist against slavery. Well, today, right now, we have things that we need to abolish, like, the prison industrial complex, right? So come on, let's go, get on the train to glory. and I think that if people are invested in liberation, if that's your value, then I think that people can come on this journey. And it's going to be painful at first to sort of uncover this past, but I promise you on the other side there is joy in that liberation. Because as human beings, what is our highest purpose? Our highest purpose is to connect with other people, right? And if we're not fully human, which I think whiteness keeps us from being fully human, we can't connect with other people. I mean, some people have said, well, if you just tell people to go join a movement, join an abolition movement or work for reparations, that's enough. But the fact is that we as white people don't show up so well in those spaces. We show up in those spaces and we create more harm. So part of what I'm trying to do in the book is say we have to do a little work on ourselves as we join these movements for liberation, whatever that looks like in your area. And I promise you there are movements for liberation right here that you can all join. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to point to is House Bill 11 that's just been, let me get this right, it was vetoed by the Utah State Legislature, but legislators are meeting tomorrow, I believe, to see if they can override that veto. And part of what I want to tell you is that the anti-trans bills that are out there, which HB 11 is one of those, the anti-trans bills are very much based on this notion of an innocent white childhood. So if you want to take some action right here, right now, reach out to your state legislators and say, don't override HB 11. Let it not be passed. Let it die in darkness. Who else has a question?
I have a question for you. I'm wondering from your experience with your family, if you could speak to how to talk to people who are resistant to having discussions about race. You brought up the example of your father who, did the newspaper flick and had the conversation end there. Especially from you who is so educated in these issues, how did you take it that next step further? What was the next conversation like? And at the end of the day, what was your relationship like? Yeah.
So in another set of open tabs, I'm working on a memoir, and I'll talk more about that. But to your question, I think it's really challenging sometimes, and I have been guilty myself of using my education and the stuff that I've learned about whiteness as an act of aggression against other white people. And I think I did that with my father. I know I did that with my father in different ways. But not always. Sometimes I was just trying to share, here's what I've learned. We were very close when I was growing up. My dad and my mother suffered with depression, so my dad was my emotionally available parent. But when I started doing this work, it created a rift between us. And part of what I did when I wrote the preface to my first book, White Lies, was I did that thing that I did here. Maybe took too long doing, but I situated myself in the preface, and I sort of said, I'm a granddaughter of someone who was in the Klan, and the book was called White Lies, and I just thought, I have to say this in the preface to this book, or I just won't feel good about it going out. And then the other thing I did was I changed my name, so that grandfather and his son were all named Harper, and I changed my name, my first name and my last name, to Jessie Daniels Ames, who was a white woman in Texas who started something called the Association for the Prevention of Lynching. So I did all that, and in the preface I also came out as a lesbian. It was a lot of information. And I sent that off to my dad, and I thought he was going to say, well done, baby, gold star. And instead, he had me locked in a psych ward for 72 hours. And that's the beginning of the memoir. But part of what I learned from that experience was that, it is really the feminist message, the feminist lesson that I have taught my students, and I'm sure many of you have taught as well, which is the danger is within our families. And so, there's a lot of stuff, especially on social media, it's very, very popular to sort of say, white people get your cousins. And I'm like, white people get your cousins, but check if they're armed. like get your cousins, but make sure you have a safety plan. You know, I mean, it's similar to the advice that was, I think, maybe 15 years ago, maybe 20, about young people, you have to come out to your parents. And I don't give that advice anymore. I'm just like, are you safe? Do you have a place to live? Are you going to be okay if you come out? And I think that sometimes, because there are these family dynamics, like mother loved you best, I always wanted daddy's love, whatever, there are these family dynamics that sometimes we are not the best messengers for talking about race in our families. Sometimes we are, but sometimes we're not. So that's a very long way to say a lot of it depends on the context. Make sure that you're safe if you're going to have these conversations, and make sure that you, at the same time, make sure that you are taking an inventory about where you're spending your time, money, and energy. If you're going home every Thanksgiving or whatever to a house where there is this kind of endemic racism, it may be time to reconsider where you're spending your time and your energy. Why are you going there? What is your investment in that set of people? And that's why part of what I argue in the book is that we have to reimagine kinship. So much of my adult life has been spent in kinship with people who, are chosen family for me. And Black people have a long tradition of that, as do Indigenous people, as do queer people. And I think it's part of our gift to the world is, look, there are other ways to do kinship besides this way that white people have done it. One more question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm wondering if you might be able to speak to the role of white saviorism, and particularly the nonprofit sector, which is also very often white women-led. And I'm just really thoughtful and mindful of the conversation we've been having this evening, and if you have any thoughts to share on that. And I say that as a nonprofit professional and a white woman.
Well, thank you very much for the question and the courage behind it, really, because that's what I'm talking about, is sort of examining our own practices. And I think there is a way in which I'm a college professor, we as college professionals train young people to go into sort of these middle-class professional roles that have sort of baked into them this kind of white saviorism, right? And what do we mean by white saviorism? I just mean this idea that I as the white person, have come to save you who are either economically impoverished or have darker skin or whatever the case may be. And that, I think, is a really central idea to being a white woman. I think it's part of the niceness, right? That how could we be doing harm if we're just helping people, right? And I think that we have to begin to think about what the harm is in that. The other thing I sort of connect to the white saviorism thing is the way that the kind of damage that we do sometimes as white mothers. So there's a way in which white motherhood, if it gets translated into those sorts of helping professions, can also be harmful. And here, I'm thinking about those reservation schools, right? Because those white women were saying, we're better mothers than those indigenous women are of their own children. And there are all sorts of ways that that's happening today, like the children who are still trapped in cages at our southern US border, right? And many of those children have been adopted out, right, by white Christian agencies. And that sort of thinking is still endemic in those sorts of things. So I think we have to, when we, as white women show up to help, we have to take a step back and say, am I really invested in their liberation as well as my own, or am I enacting a kind of dominance and aggression through this helping? So thanks very much for the question.
Give another round of applause for Dr. Daniels. Everybody take a good breath. You're gonna have to keep breathing a little bit, because that was a lot to process, and I think Dr. Daniels delivered this content with the heart and the liberation that she wants us to enact. So you're gonna be processing this for a while, so be gentle with yourself and others, and just allow it to marinate, and I don't wanna say I'll be around to process it with you. I don't wanna, because I'm doing my own processing, right? This is a learning experience for all of us, and it's exactly why I love being here at Westminster, because we get to stretch those boundaries around what's considered normal and right. So I thank you. I thank you so much. I have 2 books to give away, and Dr. Daniels is going to sign a couple of books. And so if you brought yours, I think she will sign those as well. So here's what I was thinking. 1 book to the youngest student in the room. $20, I hear 20, do I hear 19? 17. I hear 17. 14. You know what, can you come get this, or can we get it to you? Can you calm down? And the author is going to bring it to you, so that's even more special. Congratulations. As Dr. Daniels said, it's not too soon, right? The second book is to the individual who drove or flew, who came from the farthest location. Now, we're going to do this on the honor code. Who came from the farthest away? Michigan? South Salt Lake, right? Really? I heard Michigan. Wow, my home state. You won. Thank you for coming. Are you visiting or just? Well, thank you for spending some of your time here with us tonight. And I got to make sure that wasn't my book. Okay, this is mine. So again, thank you so much for taking the time out, and to the question about those you invited and they chose not to come. This is being recorded, so you can certainly share the video and maybe follow up with some conversations, and all of us can really do that. I want to remind you about the tear-off, so we can certainly get to gauge if you would like to see more experiences like this. Thank you. And with that said, we are about 5 weeks out from the end of this semester in this school year, so it's just been an amazing ride. As we are, reimagining and re-entering the world with this pandemic, I just again appreciate your time and your attention and your engagement tonight. I kept kind of peeking back to say, are they still here? Are they still? And people were just like eyeballing you, Dr. Daniels. So thank you so much. Again, Dr. Daniels will be signing books out in the hall. Have a wonderful, safe evening, and we'll see you next time.